The galaxy had long been a place of chaos and constant change, a place where alliances were fragile and power shifts could happen in the blink of an eye. In the midst of this vast universe, there was a race unlike any other, a race that once ruled the stars. The Varelians were a proud, advanced species known for their incredible technological feats and wisdom. Their empire stretched across numerous systems, thriving with flourishing cities, vast landscapes, and a culture that embraced peace and discovery. But all of that had been lost. Now, their world was dying. The once great capital, Veridris, lay in ruins. The once towering spires of their cities were now nothing more than crumbling skeletons. The skies, once a brilliant blue, were now filled with a choking ash that darkened the sun. The ground beneath them had turned barren, and the once bustling streets were silent, empty of life. It wasn't just the planet that was dying, but their entire species. There were only a few thousand Varelians left, scattered in small groups, clinging to survival in the face of an unstoppable natural disaster that had ravaged their world for decades. And to make matters worse, their cries for help had gone unanswered. The galaxy had turned its back on them. Their allies, the very races they had once helped and fought alongside, had abandoned them. One by one, the communication lines went silent, the promises of aid broken. Those who had once vowed to stand by their side now avoided their calls, unwilling to risk their own survival for a race that was doomed. The Varelians' pleas for assistance fell on deaf ears. No one would come. A single alien, the last of his kind, stood at the edge of the ruined capital, staring out over the wasteland that had once been home. His name was Karn, and he was one of the few remaining leaders of the Varelians. His once proud form was now bent with age and sorrow, his features weathered by years of suffering. His mind was heavy with the responsibility of his people's fate, and the burden of knowing that no one was coming to save them. His thoughts were interrupted by the faint hum of an old communication device, a relic of their past. It crackled to life, but the message that came through was different from anything he had heard before. It was a signal from Earth. At first, Sarn thought it was a glitch, a last desperate attempt to send out a signal, but as the message became clearer, he realized it was real. The words were simple, brief, and full of hope. "We are coming." Zarn's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Could it be that someone still cared? That someone would risk everything to help them? The message was brief, too brief to explain anything, but it was enough. It was enough to spark a flicker of hope, a hope that had long been extinguished in the hearts of his people. He could hardly believe it. The humans, the very species that had been nothing more than a distant, curious race, were offering help. The humans had no history with the Varelians. They were not allies. They had no reason to care about their fate. And yet, here they were, reaching out across the stars to offer help when everyone else had refused. Sarn felt a rush of emotions, hope, disbelief, and gratitude. But there was no time to waste. He needed to act fast. The planet's resources were nearly gone, and if the humans didn't come soon, it would be too late. The news spread quickly across the remaining Varelians, and for the first time in years, the people felt something they hadn't in a long time. Hope. It was a fragile thing, barely there, but it was enough to ignite their spirits. They had been abandoned by so many, but now there was a chance. The humans were coming. As Karn prepared to meet the human envoy, doubts clouded his mind. Could they really be trusted? The galaxy had shown them nothing but cruelty, and they had no reason to believe the humans would follow through on their promise. But there was a small part of him that clung to the belief that this wasn't a trick, that this wasn't just some cruel joke from the universe. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the situation was far from clear. The Human Council was divided. Some argued that helping the Varelians was too risky. The journey was long, and the resources required to assist a dying planet were immense. It would be dangerous for the crew, and the planet itself might be beyond saving. Others questioned the wisdom of interfering with a race that had no real ties to Earth. Why risk everything to help an alien race when their own world had its own problems? But there were others who saw the situation differently. They saw it as an opportunity to prove that humanity was capable of more than just survival, that humanity could be the beacon of hope in a dark universe. The decision wasn't easy, but after heated debates and discussions, the humans agreed. They would help. They would do what no one else had done. They would risk everything to save a species on the brink of extinction. Preparations began immediately. The human fleet was mobilized, a group of scientists, soldiers, and engineers coming together for a mission that would take them to the farthest reaches of space. They knew that this mission would not be easy. They knew that they might not return, but they also knew that this was the right thing to do. It was their chance to make a real difference, to show the galaxy that humanity was capable of kindness, bravery, and compassion. As the ships prepared to leave Earth's atmosphere, families gathered to say their goodbyes. Many of the crew members had never been away from Earth before, and the thought of journeying to a distant, unknown world was both thrilling and terrifying. Some were afraid of what lay ahead, while others were eager to be a part of something bigger than themselves. But all of them shared a sense of duty. They knew that this mission could be the turning point for not just the Varelians, but for humanity itself. And so, with a heavy heart but unwavering determination, the humans embarked on their journey. The darkness of space stretched before them, vast and empty, but they carried with them a glimmer of hope. The fate of an entire alien race rested on their shoulders. As they traveled farther from Earth, the crew faced numerous obstacles. There were moments of technical failures, miscommunications, and doubts, but they pushed on. The Varelians were waiting for them, and the humans knew that they couldn't afford to let them down. But in the back of their minds, the crew couldn't shake one thought. What if they were too late? Back on the alien world, Sarn stood in the ruins of what had once been his people's greatest city. He gazed up at the sky, watching the stars flicker in the distance. The human ships were on their way. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel something other than despair, hope. But it was a fragile hope, one that could be crushed by the weight of his people's suffering or by the cruelty of the universe. The humans were coming, but would they be in time? The journey to the Varelian homeworld was long and treacherous, taking the human fleet through the depths of space, far from the comfort of Earth. It had been days since they left the familiar sights of their home planet, and already the isolation of space was beginning to take its toll. The crew remained silent as they drifted through the stars, the vast emptiness of the galaxy surrounding them. They had no idea what awaited them on the alien world, or if they would even arrive in time to make a difference. Back on Earth, the mission was a topic of heated discussion. News reports buzzed with uncertainty, and even the families of the crew were divided. Some of them feared for their loved ones, while others supported the decision to help the Varelians. The human leaders had made their choice, but the outcome remained unclear. It was easy for those on Earth to wonder if this mission would be a success, or if they would be sending their people to a pointless death. But as the human ships continued on their path, they were determined to see this through. They couldn't turn back now, not when the Varelians' message had sparked something deep inside them. The humans weren't the kind of species to abandon others when they needed help most. They understood what it meant to be on the brink of extinction and wanted to prove that humanity could rise above its past mistakes. This was their chance to change the narrative of the universe, to stand up and do what was right. Captain Laura Rayner, one of the leaders of the fleet, sat in her quarters staring at the holographic map of the galaxy, her fingers hovering over the path to the Varelian system. The image of the alien world haunted her thoughts. The Varelians were once an incredibly advanced species, more so than humans could ever dream of being. They had discovered cures for diseases, mastered space travel far beyond anything humans had accomplished, and shared their knowledge with countless other races. And yet, in their time of need, the rest of the galaxy had turned its back on them. What if we can't make it in time? Laura whispered to herself, running a hand through her hair in frustration. There was too much at stake, and the uncertainty was gnawing at her. There was no way to know for sure whether they could help the Varelians, but she had to believe they could. The message they had sent, "We are coming," rang in her mind like a beacon of hope. Across the ship, the rest of the crew was preparing for the arrival. The scientists were already studying what they knew about the Varelians' planet and climate, trying to figure out how they could make a difference. The engineers worked tirelessly to maintain the ship's systems, checking every last detail to make sure they would be ready for anything that awaited them. The soldiers were preparing for the worst, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they might not need to fight at all. Sarn, back on his home planet, had received the news that the humans were finally on their way. His heart fluttered with a mixture of excitement and fear. Could they truly save them? Could these strange humans, who had never been involved in the galaxy's politics or battles, really make a difference? It seemed too good to be true, but he had to believe. If he didn't, then his people would be lost forever. The last few days had been agonizing for the Varelians. They had been clinging to the final shreds of hope, waiting for some kind of miracle. They had tried everything they could to survive, but the planet's climate had become too volatile. The resources had all but disappeared. Their only chance lay in the hands of these humans, these unknown saviors from a distant world. Zarn stood on a balcony overlooking the ruins of his city, watching as a faint light appeared in the sky. It was faint at first, nothing more than a shimmering star, but then it grew brighter. The first human ships were arriving. His heart raced as he watched them, knowing that this moment would decide the fate of his people. From the humans' perspective, the arrival was met with awe. The alien world stretched out beneath them like a barren wasteland, the atmosphere thick and toxic. As their ships descended into the planet's atmosphere, they could see the destruction firsthand. The massive craters and ruined cities stood as silent testimony to the devastation that had already taken place. It was even worse than they had imagined. The images from the planet's surface didn't do justice to the destruction. The human ships landed, kicking up clouds of dust and ash, the heavy thuds of the landings echoing across the barren terrain. As they disembarked, the humans were greeted by Xarn and a handful of other Varelians who had managed to survive. The once proud race now appeared fragile, their eyes filled with fear and sorrow. Xarn looked at them with a mixture of gratitude and skepticism. Could they really help? He wasn't sure, but there was no time to waste. He turned to the humans, his voice shaky but hopeful. "We have little time left. Please, do what you can," he pleaded. The humans, despite the harsh conditions, immediately set to work. Medical teams began tending to the wounded and sick, while engineers and scientists surveyed the planet's damage. The rest of the crew began setting up a base camp, preparing to provide food and shelter to those who had managed to survive. But not everyone was convinced that their efforts would be enough. A group of alien soldiers, those who had survived the disasters but were too broken to fight, looked at the humans with distrust. They watched every move the humans made, unsure whether to accept their help or turn them away. Despite the skepticism, the humans continued their work. They began repairing damaged technology and offering solutions to stabilize the planet's climate. They sent out distress signals to Earth, requesting more help, more resources, and more personnel. But there were no guarantees. They couldn't know if they would be able to save the planet, but they weren't going to give up without trying. In the following days, the humans faced countless challenges. The Varelians' planet was harsh, and their resources were limited. The air was toxic, and the terrain was unforgiving. But the humans pressed on, undeterred by the growing difficulty. As the days passed, the small flicker of hope grew into something stronger. The Varelians began to trust the humans, and for the first time in years, they saw a glimmer of hope. The planet was still dying, but perhaps, just perhaps, it wasn't too late. As the humans continued their work, the suspense hung in the air like a heavy weight. Would their efforts be enough? Would they manage to save the Varelians before it was too late? Karn couldn't help but feel both gratitude and fear. He had put his trust in the humans, but there was so much more left to do. And time was running out. The human fleet had arrived, but the situation on the Virelian homeworld was even worse than they had anticipated. The desolation that greeted them was unlike anything they had ever seen. An entire planet that had once thrived now reduced to a shadow of its former glory. The once proud cities, now reduced to rubble, stood as silent witnesses to the destruction that had consumed the Virelian civilization. The air, thick with ash, carried a sense of foreboding, as if the planet itself was grieving the loss of its people. The human teams quickly set up camp, but it was clear that no amount of preparation could truly prepare them for the scale of the task ahead. Scientists, engineers, and medics worked in a blur, coordinating their efforts to address the various crises they faced. The damage to the environment was far-reaching. Severe climate instability, poisoned water sources, and a lack of breathable air in many places. The first priority was survival, and that meant providing shelter and clean water to the few Virelians who remained. Zarn, who had once been a leader of his people, now found himself standing in the background, a silent observer of the humans' efforts. It was a strange feeling for him. For so long, his species had been the ones to offer help to others, solving problems, teaching, guiding. And now, it was his turn to accept help. He wasn't sure how to feel about it, but he couldn't deny the sense of relief he felt seeing the humans working tirelessly to save what little remained of their world. "Is it enough?" Sarn asked softly, his voice carrying the weight of years of despair. He had been standing by the central communication station when Captain Rayner approached him. The human leader, though tired, had a sense of determination in her eyes. "We're doing everything we can," Laura Rayner replied, her voice calm but firm. "The damage is extensive, but there's still time to make a difference. We'll need more resources, more hands, but you're not alone in this." Sarn nodded slowly, taking in her words. He wanted to believe her, but there was a deep-rooted fear that clung to him. Fear that no matter what they did, it might be too late. His people had suffered for so long, and they had watched as the universe turned its back on them. How could they be sure the humans wouldn't abandon them too? As the days passed, the humans began to make visible progress. They set up air purifiers to clear the atmosphere, planting life-sustaining plants to restore balance to the ecosystem. The medical teams worked around the clock, tending to the sick and injured, and slowly, the Virelians who had been hiding in the shadows began to reemerge. But even as the humans took these steps, there were still those among the Virelians who weren't sure whether they could trust the humans. The scars of abandonment ran deep. One night, as Laura Rayner walked through the makeshift camp, she saw Xarn standing by the ruined remnants of a once grand building. He was staring up at the stars, his mind lost in thought. She approached him quietly, her footsteps soft against the dust-covered ground. "You look like you're a million miles away," she said, offering him a small smile. Xarn turned to face her, his eyes weary but filled with a quiet resolve. "I'm just thinking about the past. How we got here. We thought we were invincible, that we would never fall. And yet here we are, relying on strangers to save us." Laura didn't have a ready answer. She had heard stories of the Virelians fall from grace, how their once mighty empire had crumbled under its own weight, how their technological advancements had brought them to the brink of hubris. And now, here they were, clinging to life, with no more allies in sight. "We don't always get to choose the circumstances we're born into," she said softly. "Sometimes, all we can do is choose what we do with the time we have left. You can still make a difference. You still have a chance." Zarn's gaze shifted to the horizon, where the faint glow of human ships illuminated the night sky. "We've been given a chance," he said, his voice low. "But I can't shake the feeling that we're too far gone, that even with all your help, it may not be enough." Laura watched him for a moment, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She understood the fear behind them. It wasn't just the fear of failure. It was the fear of losing everything. Their culture, their history, their people. and it wasn't something she could easily promise to fix. But she could offer him something else, her commitment to keep fighting. "We won't give up," she said, her voice steady. "Not while there's even the smallest chance. We're here because we believe in your people, and we'll keep working together until we either succeed or we can't fight anymore." Zarn took a deep breath, the weight of his thoughts pressing on him. For the first time since the humans had arrived, he allowed himself to believe. Maybe, just maybe, they could save them. But doubt still lingered, lurking in the back of his mind. How long would they be able to keep this up? How long before the planet's destruction became irreversible? The humans worked tirelessly, their commitment unwavering despite the challenges they faced. As they repaired the damaged infrastructure and restored the vital systems, they began to notice something strange. The atmosphere seemed to be clearing. The air, once thick with poison and dust, was becoming more breathable. The once dying plants were starting to sprout new life. The Varelians who had remained were slowly regaining strength. But not all of them were content with the humans' presence. A faction of Varelians, those who had been most severely affected by the planet's collapse, were growing restless. They had seen their world fall into ruin, and they were afraid of being disappointed again. What if the humans couldn't keep their promises? What if they were only prolonging the inevitable? One evening, Sarn overheard a heated argument between two of his fellow Varelians. "We've trusted them for too long," one of them shouted. "They're not like us. They can't possibly understand what we've gone through. They'll leave us just like everyone else." Sarn stepped forward, his presence silencing the conversation. "I understand your fear," he said, his voice steady. "But we have to be careful with our choices. We've already seen what happens when we close ourselves off. We can't let that happen again. The humans are our last chance." The group fell silent, unsure of how to respond. Some nodded in agreement, while others remained unconvinced. But it was a turning point. The conversation shifted. For the first time, there was a glimmer of unity among the Varelians. They weren't all on the same page, but they were beginning to see the value of the humans' efforts. As the days turned into weeks, the humans and Varelians worked side by side, fighting to save what little remained of their world. The sense of desperation that had once hung over the Varelians began to fade, replaced by a fragile but growing hope. The humans' efforts were beginning to show results, slower than anyone had hoped, but steady progress was being made. Yet, as the humans and Varelians worked together, there was still the lingering question: would it be enough? Would the planet's wounds heal in time, or was it too late for them all? Every day that passed brought them closer to a solution, or to the bitter truth that they might have arrived too late to save the Varelians. Only time would tell. But for the first time in a long while, Sarn allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could succeed. And with that belief, the smallest flicker of hope burned just a little brighter. The days that followed brought a strange mix of hope and uncertainty. The human efforts on the Varelian homeworld were slowly beginning to show some tangible results, but the problems were far from over. Every step forward seemed to be met with another obstacle, and the planet's climate continued to be unpredictable. Yet despite the challenges, something had changed. There was a quiet sense of unity among the Varelians and the humans, a shared purpose that had never existed before. Captain Laura Rayner and Sarn spent more time together in those days than either had anticipated. As the leader of the human mission, Laura knew that the fate of the Varelians rested heavily on her shoulders. There were moments when doubt crept into her thoughts, times when she wondered if they would be able to truly turn the tide for the dying species. But Sarn's unwavering resolve gave her the strength to keep moving forward. He was no longer just the leader of a fallen race. He was a symbol of perseverance, a living testament to the will to survive, even against all odds. One morning, as Laura walked through the camp, she saw Sarn standing in front of a small group of Varelians, his voice strong but filled with a quiet sadness. He was speaking to them about their past, about the days when their civilization was at its peak. Laura knew that for him, this wasn't just about sharing history. It was about holding on to the memories of what once was, trying to remind his people that they hadn't completely lost themselves. There was a time, Tharn was saying, when we stood on top of the galaxy. Our technology was unmatched. We had everything we needed: knowledge, power, prosperity. We thought we were invincible, but we failed to recognize the fragility of what we had built. We failed to see the cracks in the foundation until it was too late. Laura couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the alien leader. She knew that his people were proud, but that pride had been shattered. He had been through so much, yet he still found the strength to lead. "You've done more than most could ever dream of," Laura said, approaching Xarn once the crowd dispersed. "You've kept your people alive through all of this. No matter what happens next, that's something to be proud of." Xarn turned to her, a tired but grateful smile on his face. "We only survived because we never gave up. But I'm not sure if that will be enough. We've lost so much. We've seen everything slip away. Now we must rely on those who didn't abandon us. And even that feels uncertain." Laura placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice full of reassurance. "We're not going to give up. Not while there's still hope. We'll keep working. Together." The rest of the camp was also seeing signs of progress, albeit small ones. The air was becoming less toxic, and the crops the humans had planted were beginning to take root. The shelters were providing refuge from the planet's harsh environment, and for the first time in a long while, the Varelians began to smile again. They weren't fully healed, but there was a sense that, with time, they might just recover. Yet, even as things improved, there were still challenges ahead. The Virelian faction that had been most resistant to human help continued to voice their concerns. They feared that this fragile cooperation would fall apart, and that once again, the humans would leave them to die. Their distrust was rooted in years of isolation and betrayal, and it wasn't something that could be erased overnight. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of red and orange, Xarn stood on the balcony of one of the shelters, looking out over the ruined city. He was deep in thought, the weight of his people's future pressing down on him. Captain Rayner had told him they would see this through, but a part of him still couldn't shake the fear that they were too late, that the Varelians' time had passed. Laura joined him on the balcony, her presence a quiet comfort. "It's strange," she said, gazing out at the horizon. "I never thought I'd be standing on an alien world, trying to help a race that most of humanity didn't even know existed. But here we are." Xarn nodded, his expression distant. "We never imagined our world would end up like this. We always believed we were too great to fall. But here we are, and now we wait, hoping that the humans can pull us back from the brink." "There's no waiting," Laura said firmly, turning to face him. "We're not just waiting for a miracle. We're making one happen. Every day, we're working together to turn this planet around. You may not see it yet, but we're making progress. And progress takes time." Xarn glanced at her, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "I want to believe that. I truly do. But the scars of abandonment run deep, even deeper than I realized. Trust is hard to come by when you've been betrayed by so many. I worry that it might be too late." Laura's gaze softened, and she stepped closer, her voice quiet but steady. "I know it's hard to trust again, but we're not the others. We're here to help, not to leave. If there's one thing I've learned in all my years of leadership, it's that sometimes trust is built one small action at a time. And that's what we're doing now. Every little bit counts." For the first time in weeks, Xarn felt a sense of peace settle in his heart. It wasn't much, but it was something. Maybe, just maybe, they could pull through. Maybe the Varelians weren't entirely beyond saving. He still wasn't sure if it would be enough, but he was beginning to feel that the humans truly believed in them. That belief, even in its fragility, was enough to give him hope. As days turned into weeks, the situation continued to improve. The Virelian cities that had been reduced to ruins began to show signs of rebuilding. New life was sprouting in places where nothing had grown for years. It was slow, painstaking work, but every victory was celebrated, no matter how small. The Varelians, who had once been skeptical of the humans, were beginning to trust them more, seeing the progress that was being made. But not everyone was convinced. A small faction of Varelians continued to voice their doubts, and their distrust festered like a wound that wouldn't heal. There were whispers of rebellion, of turning away from the humans' help, and some feared that this fragile alliance might shatter at any moment. Still, the majority of the Varelians were beginning to believe in the humans. They saw the efforts, the sacrifices, and they were starting to believe that maybe the humans wouldn't abandon them, as so many others had. The humans, too, had their doubts. They weren't blind to the difficulties they faced, and they knew that they had their own obstacles to overcome. But they had made a commitment, and they were determined to see it through. The question remained, would they be able to save the Varelians in time? Would their efforts be enough to heal a world that had been broken for so long? As the humans and Varelians continued to work side by side, the tension was palpable, but so was the hope. And even though the road ahead was uncertain, there was one thing that the humans and Varelians had in common: the belief that, together, they might just have a chance to save a world on the brink of extinction. Only time would tell if their hope was enough to pull them from the edge of destruction. But for now, they had a purpose. They had each other. And with that, there was still a glimmer of possibility that the Varelians might yet survive. As the human teams continued their efforts on the Varelian homeworld, they had encountered yet another series of setbacks. The Varelian planet, battered and broken, was not going to be fixed in a matter of days or weeks. The damage to the environment was vast, and the climate shifts were still wreaking havoc on the fragile ecosystem. But despite these setbacks, one thing had become increasingly clear: the humans weren't going to give up. They had faced countless obstacles before, and each time they found a way to push through. This time, it was no different. Xarn stood at the edge of the once vibrant city of his people, now reduced to crumbling ruins. His gaze swept over the destruction, his heart heavy with the weight of it all. But as he looked around, something caught his eye: a faint spark of green among the gray. Some of the crops that the humans had planted were beginning to grow. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a small smile. "Captain Rayner," Xarn called, waving her over. Laura Rayner, who had been overseeing the repair of one of the air purification stations, turned and made her way toward him. She, too, had seen the small signs of progress that had emerged over the past few days. Her expression softened when she saw the faint smile on Xarn's face. "Something good for a change?" she asked, her voice light. Xarn nodded, though his smile didn't reach his eyes entirely. "The crops, they're growing. It's just a small patch, but it's a start." Laura looked over at the patch of green growing in the midst of the wasteland. It was a powerful symbol of what they had been working toward: life returning to a planet that had been dying for so long. But she knew better than to get too hopeful. There was still a long way to go. "That's more than we had yesterday," Laura said, her tone still optimistic, though tempered by the knowledge that the work was far from over. The weeks that followed were marked by a series of small victories and equally frustrating setbacks. The Varelian people, who had once been hesitant to trust the humans, were starting to see results. There was still tension, of course. There always would be. But there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. More and more Varelians began to participate in the recovery efforts. They worked alongside the humans, learning new techniques to purify water, restore their damaged cities, and protect their fragile environment. Slowly but surely, they were finding hope again. Yet, as they worked, the human team continued to feel the strain. The human fleet wasn't equipped to provide for the Varelians in the long term. They had been sent with a mission to help, but they were underprepared for the scale of the task. As Captain Rayner stood at the command center late one evening, her fingers hovered over the communications panel, debating whether to send a distress signal back to Earth. They needed reinforcements, more supplies, and most importantly, more time. We can't keep doing this alone, Laura murmured to herself, staring at the star maps displayed before her. We need help. We need more resources to fix this. A voice broke into her thoughts. We can't afford to wait, Captain. Laura turned to find Lieutenant Kessler, her second in command, standing in the doorway. Kessler was a practical man, always focused on the facts, and right now, the facts were dire. I know, Laura said quietly, her hands clenched into fists. But if we don't get help, I don't know how long we can keep this up. We've already stretched our resources to the breaking point. Kessler sighed and leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. We're making progress. The Varelians are starting to help. They're beginning to trust us again, even if it's just a little. I hope you're right, Laura replied, her voice low. But they've been abandoned by everyone else. Every day that passes, I can see the doubt in their eyes. The fear that we'll leave them like the rest. And that's why we can't, Kessler said, a determined look in his eyes. We can't let them down. We're their last hope. Laura met his gaze, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe in that hope. It wasn't easy. It never was. But if there was one thing she had learned over the years, it was that human resilience could move mountains when pushed far enough. And they were pushing. Every day, every hour, they were pushing forward, no matter how impossible the task seemed. As the weeks turned into months, the work continued, and so did the struggle. But Xarn and the other Varelians slowly began to see real change. They saw human engineers repairing broken infrastructures and human scientists working on advanced technology to slow down the climate changes that were affecting the planet. The medical teams had all but eradicated the last of the diseases that had plagued the Varelians, and the wounded from the early days of the mission had all been treated and cared for. The survivors were no longer just surviving. They were rebuilding. Xarn had become a symbol of the hope the humans had brought to his people. He continued to lead with a quiet strength, and despite the lingering fear that still gripped him, he began to see the possibility of a future for his species once again. One afternoon, as Laura walked through the camp, she was stopped by Xarn. His face was serious, but his eyes held something new, something she hadn't seen before. There was a spark of hope in them. He didn't look defeated anymore. He looked like a leader again. "Captain," Xarn said, his voice steady, "I wanted to thank you for everything." Laura frowned slightly, surprised by his words. "There's no need to thank us. We're just doing our part." "No," Xarn said, shaking his head. "You're doing more than that. You're showing us that there's still a chance, that we don't have to die out." Laura's heart swelled with a mix of pride and humility. "We're in this together, Xarn. This isn't just about saving your people. It's about showing the galaxy that we can work together to overcome the worst of what's been thrown at us." Xarn took a deep breath, looking out over the camp. For the first time in a long while, the future seemed less uncertain. "I never thought I would see the day where I would stand side by side with humans, rebuilding my world. But here we are. And we'll see it through," Laura said firmly. "Whatever it takes." But even as Xarn and the humans worked toward a new future, there were still shadows looming. The faction of Varelians who had been resistant to the humans' help were growing more vocal. They weren't sure if they could trust the humans to stay. And there were murmurs of rebellion among some of the Varelians who felt they had been abandoned for far too long. Xarn tried to keep the peace, but the cracks in their fragile alliance were beginning to show. One night, after a particularly heated argument between two factions of Varelians, Xarn and Laura found themselves standing together again, looking out at the stars. "I don't know how long we can keep this together," Xarn said quietly, his voice full of the weight of his people's history. "There's so much distrust, so much pain. How can we heal when so many of us still feel abandoned?" Laura didn't have an easy answer, but she knew one thing for sure: they couldn't give up. "We'll keep fighting," she said, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "We'll keep showing them that we're not like the others. We'll prove that they can trust us." Xarn nodded slowly, the burden of leadership heavy on his shoulders. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they could rebuild. And even though the future was still uncertain, the humans and Varelians had come a long way. There was still work to do, but they had proven something that no one could take away from them. They weren't giving up. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance. The question remained, however, could they heal the scars of a broken world, or would the cracks eventually tear them all apart? Time would tell. The days grew long, and the effort to rebuild continued, but despite the progress, an undeniable tension filled the air. The Varelians had started to heal, but deep wounds of mistrust remained. While most of the population worked side by side with the humans, a few factions still harbored suspicions. The fear of abandonment, which had plagued their species for years, was not something easily wiped away. The sense of betrayal ran deep, and no matter how hard Captain Laura Rayner and Tarn worked, it felt as though that shadow of doubt loomed over every step they took. Sarn felt it most acutely. As a leader, it was his responsibility to ensure his people's survival, to guide them through this time of uncertainty. Yet even with his newfound hope, there were days when he was overwhelmed with doubt. Could they really rebuild? Could they trust the humans enough to accept their help fully? One evening, Sarn found himself standing alone by the edge of the camp, staring out at the horizon. The Virelian homeworld had once been a place of beauty, but now, the landscape was littered with the ruins of a once great civilization. The skies, which had once been clear and filled with the light of two suns, were now often covered with clouds. The air, though improving, still carried a dangerous toxicity that made every breath a reminder of how fragile their world had become. Laura approached quietly, her footsteps soft on the dirt road. She had seen the distant look in Sarn's eyes many times before. He wasn't just looking at the ruined city, he was looking at his people's future. "You're thinking about the past again, aren't you?" Laura asked gently, standing beside him. Sarn didn't answer at first, his gaze fixed on the far-off mountains. "We were once a proud species. We believed we were invincible," he said softly, his voice tinged with a deep sadness. "But now, we're not even sure we'll survive." Laura studied him for a moment before speaking. "No one can change the past. We can only control what happens next." He glanced at her, the weariness in his eyes stark. "What if it's too late? What if, despite everything we've done, we can't save our people?" "You're not alone in this, Karn," she said firmly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to carry this burden by yourself. We're here. We're not going anywhere. You're not alone." He nodded slowly, but the doubt still lingered in his eyes. Despite all the reassurance, the doubts wouldn't leave him. They never truly did. Days turned into weeks, and despite the growing trust between the Varelians and humans, a storm was brewing, one that no one could have predicted. The human fleet, which had been sent to aid the Varelians, had always been limited in resources. The plan had been to assist the Varelians long enough for them to get back on their feet, to restore their environment, their cities, and their people. But the reality was becoming increasingly difficult. The human fleet was stretched thin. The damage to the Virelian world was vast, and the resources required to sustain the efforts were running out. One evening, Captain Rayner received an urgent message from Earth. As she listened to the transmission, her heart sank. The message wasn't good news, it was a warning. Earth had already sent what it could. Reinforcements were not coming. The resources, the personnel, and the supplies were limited. The message from command was clear. The mission was no longer a priority. Laura sat in silence, processing the information. She knew that the humans had done all they could, but the timing couldn't have been worse. Just when the Varelians were starting to show signs of recovery, just when they were beginning to trust the humans, the rug was being pulled out from under them. She stood up from her desk, her mind racing. She couldn't abandon them, not after everything they had been through together. She couldn't leave Sarn and the others to face the consequences alone. "What do we do now?" she muttered under her breath. That night, Sarn sought her out. He had heard rumors of the message from Earth. His expression was grim when he approached her. "Captain Rayner," he said quietly, "is it true? Will the humans be leaving?" Laura's heart clenched. She had been dreading this moment. She nodded, her voice heavy with the weight of what she had to say. "Yes. Earth can't send more resources. They're pulling back, Sarn." Sarn's face, which had been weary with the weight of leadership, now fell further. He looked like a leader who had been left to face an impossible task. "I knew it," he said softly, turning away to hide the pain in his eyes. "I knew we couldn't count on anyone. We've been abandoned before, and it seems we're being abandoned again." Laura reached out, grabbing his arm. "No, Sarn, we haven't been abandoned. Not yet. We have time. We can still do this. We just have to figure out another way." His eyes were filled with frustration and disbelief. "How, Captain? How do we figure this out with no resources, no reinforcements? You've done everything you could. Your people have done everything they could. But we're still fighting against a dying world. And time is running out." Laura exhaled sharply, her mind racing as she searched for a solution. But the truth was, she didn't have one. The situation was more dire than she had ever imagined. The clock was ticking, and there were no easy answers. "I don't know," she admitted finally, her voice quiet but resolute. "But I do know this. We can't stop fighting. Not yet." Sarn turned back to her, his face hard with determination. "Then we fight. But if we fail—" "We won't fail," Laura interrupted, her voice firm, though uncertainty tugged at the edges of her words. "We're not giving up. Not yet." Over the next few days, Laura and Sarn gathered their teams and strategized, brainstorming what they could do with the dwindling resources. The human teams continued working tirelessly, pushing forward in whatever way they could. Some of the human engineers began working with the Virelian scientists, combining their knowledge to find new solutions to the planet's environmental crisis. Together, they developed new methods for harvesting the planet's resources sustainably, hoping to reduce the strain on their supplies. But despite the hope, a sense of desperation was in the air. The human teams, now running on the last of their supplies, began to show signs of exhaustion. There were moments when Laura saw the fatigue in their eyes, heard the weariness in their voices. They too were feeling the pressure. They had been on this mission for so long, and the idea that they might not be able to save the Virelians was starting to sink in. The final days before the human fleet was to leave felt like an endless battle against time. Every step forward seemed to be met with 2 steps back. The Virelians, who had started to heal, were now faced with the terrifying possibility of being abandoned once more. Sarn's leadership was being tested more than ever before. He struggled with the crushing responsibility of knowing that if the humans left, the Virelians would be left to face a dying world with no hope. But as the days grew darker, something unexpected happened. A group of Virelian leaders, once the fiercest opponents of the humans' help, approached Karn. They had seen the progress, witnessed the effort that the humans had put into saving their planet. They had seen their world begin to change, and they knew they could not let it end now. These leaders, realizing the importance of what the humans had done, pledged their support to the final effort to save their species. They offered their technology, their knowledge, and their resources. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Together, they formulated a new plan. A plan that involved more Virelians taking an active role in rebuilding their planet, using the humans' guidance and their own expertise. With this new unity, hope began to return to the planet once more. Sarn and Laura stood side by side, looking over the camp where the last of the human fleet prepared to depart. "We may not have a miracle," Sarn said quietly, "but we have something better. We have each other." Laura smiled softly, her heart heavy with both hope and uncertainty. "We'll see this through, together." The question still lingered. Would the Virelians truly survive? Only time would tell. But for the first time, there was a glimmer of something more than just hope. There was belief, And that, perhaps, was the most powerful force of all. The days following the unexpected alliance between the Virelian factions marked a new chapter in the battle for survival. With the humans' departure on the horizon, there was a renewed sense of urgency among both the Virelians and the humans. Time was running out, and the clock was ticking louder with every passing day. Yet, even in the face of impending doom, something had shifted in the hearts of the people on both sides. There was a realization that they were all in this together now. The past betrayals, the scars of abandonment, were starting to fade into the background as they all focused on a single, undeniable truth. They couldn't afford to fail. Zarn stood at the center of the camp, observing the bustling activity around him. The Virelians and humans worked side by side, their hands dirty with the effort to restore what was lost. The Virelian scientists, who had once mistrusted the humans' methods, were now learning from them, their faces set with determination. The human engineers had become their teachers, guiding them on how to extract the last remnants of usable resources from the planet's damaged ecosystem. Even the Virelian medical teams had begun to share their own knowledge, offering new ways to treat the ailments that had once decimated their people. But despite the cooperation, there were still shadows lingering in the back of Zarn's mind. Was this enough? Was it too little, too late? The humans were running low on supplies, and Earth had made it clear that reinforcements weren't coming. The humans, too, were feeling the strain. There was no longer a sense of fresh energy, no abundance of resources to draw from. Every day, every hour, they were all giving what little they had left, hoping it would be enough to secure a future for the Virelians. Zarn's gaze turned towards the horizon, where the human fleet's transport ships were docked, ready to depart. The fleet had already been reduced, leaving only the smallest crew behind to continue their mission. Laura Rayner, the human captain who had stayed behind to see the mission through to the end, stood beside him, her expression serious as she looked out at the ships as well. "You know, when I first arrived here, I didn't think we'd make it this far," Laura said, breaking the silence between them. Her voice was tired, but there was a fierce strength behind it, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as him. Zarn didn't answer immediately, choosing instead to study the way the camp was coming together. Humans and Virelians alike were working tirelessly, and there was a palpable sense of unity, something he hadn't seen in so long. But still, the fear lingered in his chest. How much longer could they hold on? "I didn't think so either," Zarn replied quietly. "But here we are." There was a moment of shared silence as they both looked at the crews working tirelessly. Then, Laura's voice broke the stillness once more. "We might not be able to save everything," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "But we can save something, and that's worth fighting for." Zarn's eyes met hers, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to believe it. They could save something, even if it wasn't everything. Even if their efforts weren't perfect, they were doing something, and that mattered. "It's all we can do," Zarn said, his voice stronger now, the weight of responsibility still heavy, but not as crushing as it had once been. "We fight to the end, no matter what." As the days wore on, the progress continued. The Virelians' efforts, bolstered by human knowledge, were starting to bear fruit. The new crops were beginning to flourish, the air was slowly becoming cleaner, and the worst of the planet's diseases had been eradicated. The cities, though still in ruins, were being rebuilt with the combined strength of both species. Every day, the cracks in the planet's shattered surface seemed a little less obvious. Yet, despite all this progress, Zarn couldn't shake the feeling that something still wasn't right. There was always the nagging doubt in the back of his mind. Was this enough to secure their future? Would the Virelians truly be able to stand on their own once the humans were gone? But there was something that had begun to change in him. The Virelians were no longer just dependent on the humans. They had learned, adapted, and overcome. Yes, they still needed help, still needed guidance, but they were no longer helpless. They had learned what it took to rebuild, to survive. And that was what mattered most. Then, one day, an unexpected call came through. Laura Rayner received a new transmission from Earth. She had been expecting more bad news, perhaps even a confirmation that the mission was officially over. But the message that came through was different from what she had anticipated. It was from a high-ranking official in the United Earth government. "Captain Rayner," the official began, "we've been monitoring your progress closely. The Varelians have made impressive strides. Despite the setbacks, it seems you've turned a corner. We understand the difficulty you've faced, and we appreciate your dedication. The situation on the ground has changed. Earth has decided to send a new fleet to assist." For a moment, Laura couldn't believe what she was hearing. A new fleet? More supplies? Reinforcements? "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. "You're sending more help? After all this time?" The official's tone was firm, but there was something else there. Perhaps relief, perhaps hope. "Yes, Captain. We've received new intelligence about the stability of the situation. The Varelians' recovery has exceeded expectations, and we believe they can sustain themselves in the long run. But we are sending additional resources to ensure their continued success." Laura let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. For the first time in months, she allowed herself a moment of pure relief. They weren't alone. Earth had come through. The reinforcements would help stabilize the situation, and the Varelians would have the chance they needed to secure their future. She immediately relayed the message to Xarn, who was standing nearby, helping a group of Varelians plant the latest round of crops. When he heard the news, a wave of disbelief washed over his face. "You're certain?" he asked, his voice shaky with the weight of the news. Laura nodded, smiling. "I'm certain. Earth is sending a new fleet. We're not alone anymore." Xarn. For the first time in what felt like forever, hope surged through Xarn's heart. He looked around at the people working together, humans and Varelians, and for the first time, he truly believed that they could make it. They had fought so hard, so long. They had faced unimaginable odds, but they had survived. And now, it seemed that the future wasn't as uncertain as it had once seemed. "We still have a long way to go," Xarn said, his voice filled with newfound resolve. "But this is the first real sign that we might just make it." As the new fleet began its journey toward the Varelian homeworld, the mood among the humans and Varelians alike began to shift. The future, once uncertain, was now filled with possibility. The scars of the past were still there, but they had learned something invaluable. They were stronger together. Xarn and Laura stood together, looking out over the work being done, their hearts filled with the same quiet but powerful hope. They knew that this was just the beginning. The journey would be long, and there were still many challenges to face. But for the first time in a long time, they both knew that the Varelians would survive. And maybe, just maybe, they would thrive. As the stars twinkled overhead, it was clear that the struggle wasn't over. But the fight for a better future had only just begun.